Welcome to the HR on the Offensive podcast, a weekly podcast by Lace Partners, a fundamentally different HR and payroll consultancy. Each week, we tackle some of the most interesting topics facing senior HR professionals. So whether that's from employee value proposition, performance management, people strategy, or even payroll, we cover it all. So join us for the next 30 minutes. And if you like what you hear, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Now, on with the show. Hello, it's Chris from the HR on the Offensive podcast, and I am doing a quick intro on the podcast that we are featuring for you today, which is with Tom Shurrock and Becki Lovelady. Tom from Beamery and Becki from the team at Lace. Really interesting chat that we had today. We talked all things strategic workforce planning and the link that it has to becoming a skills-based organisation. But what was really interesting to hear Tom talk was when he started talking more around this idea of having task-based organisations rather than skills-based organizations. So Tom talks about, you have jobs and you have people that have to complete tasks within those jobs, and what sits underneath that is the skills that they actually need to complete those tasks. And we talk about the future of thinking like that. We talk about the role in which technology can play in helping you to decode the skills that you've got so that you can be more sophisticated in building out a task-based organization approach. This is a podcast which is linked to our Becoming Skills Powered campaign. So if you want to check it out, you can do so. You just need to go to the Lace Partners website and check out the campaign section, and you'll be able to find more podcasts, more blogs, some video content, and also some of the details of events that we've got running as well. But from me, I'm going to pause it there and hand back over to myself for the rest of the podcast. Catch you in a bit. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to the latest HR on the Offensive podcast. It's me, Chris Howard from Lace Partners, joining you on this fabulous Thursday in which we release our podcast. Today's podcast is linked to our campaign that we've been running. If you haven't checked it out yet, it's called Becoming Skills Powered, and it's really focused around this idea of many organizations really finding it interesting or having a desire to be moving towards becoming skills-based organizations. Now, one of the key parts of that, and I was at an evening event last night with a number of heads of people analytics from a variety of different large multinational companies. We talked about analytics, but we were talking specifically about strategic workforce planning. And so I wanted to get a fabulous guest from a wonderful company called Beamery to talk about that. I've also got somebody from our people and workforce analytics team, a regular on the podcast who is back again because she just can't keep away. Becki Lovelady. Becki, how are you doing?
I'm good, thank you. Yeah, nice to be back again.
Yeah, it's good to have you back. This will be an interesting topic, I think, because I think there's lots of talk and people, there's conferences, strategic workforce planning conferences that take place, but there's different people have different definitions or the way in which they approach it. And I think a lot of people take the view of SWP as what's happening over there and is everyone more advanced than us? And so what I want to do today is just talk a little bit around that, the role of it in skills-based organizations. Shall we get our guest on first? It is Tom Shurrock, who is Vice President of Product at Beamery. Tom, how are you doing, sir?
I'm great. Thank you, Chris. Thanks for having me on today. Really appreciate it and looking forward to a good discussion around strategic workforce planning. It's a topic that's been boiling around in our industry for a long time, I think.
And getting an idea from you and from Becki as well on things like the role of tech and, we'll find out a little bit about Beamery as well.
Sure.
Before we do that, and I get you to talk a little bit about Beamery, we've got a fundamentally different question. So those people listening in, if you've never listened to one of our podcasts, we have a regular question that we ask, a bit of an icebreaker, completely random and fundamentally different, so not related to HR whatsoever, designed to completely trip up both my guest and co-host. Today's question is a bit of fun. It is that I've just read a story that big Iron Age hoard, bronze hoard, has been found in Yorkshire. And it got me to thinking, I'm going to ask Tom this first, and then I'm going to give you my input, and then we'll go to Becki. If you were to dig up your garden, what do you think you might find, Tom?
Fantastic question. We're in a fairly new build, so I don't think a lot. I know something we won't find, which is when we bought this house, when we got legal paperwork around the deeds, our lawyer called us up and said, you cannot open up a supermarket on your land. And this is because what happens in the UK is large supermarkets buy up land in the areas in which their competitors operate and sell it to housing developers. And part of that sell-on is that no one can ever open up a supermarket on that land. And it's the way in which they can protect themselves from competitors coming onto their turf. And then we got into a pretty heated debate with my lawyer around, what does this mean? I have 2 daughters. Can they open up a lemonade stand? Is that okay? And we got into a surreal conversation around what's the bounds of okay or not okay. So yeah, that's something we will not find where I live, is a supermarket, because we are legally bound not to build one.
It's not quite answering your question, but I love it anyway. And the idea that you've been fighting to get that lemonade stand outside the front, and then some Simpsons-esque army of lawyers from Sainsbury's, Tesco's, Waitrose, or whatever it is, turning up on your door and trampling on the lemonade stand. That's quite funny. Mine would be an unexploded World War II bomb. I live in Uxbridge, and we have the old Battle of Britain bunker, which is where they did the Battle of Britain. It's an underground bunker where they did a lot of the organisation for some of the Battle of Britain planes and flyovers. So mine would be, if I dug deep enough, probably an unexploded bomb, which is why I do not touch my grass whatsoever. I just lightly trim it. Becki, just to wrap it up before we go into the SWP conversation, what would you have in your back garden?
Well, I'm not great on archaeology. I have watched Indiana Jones, but that's about the extent of it. I don't want to sound like the world's most northern person, but I do live up north. I live in a place called Lee, which is just in between Wigan and Manchester. And it's a lot of old coal mines around there. Our football team's called the Colliers. So I'm pretty sure I would find a lot of coal. And in fact, I have found coal just in the fields at the back of our garden. So that's about as much as I know about what's underneath my house. And that's probably, a lot of coal. Hopefully that might be my fortune in the future.
Although the way that things are going with green energy may be right. Let's talk a little bit about our subject. Before we do that, let's get a little context. Tom, can you tell our wonderful listeners a little bit about yourself and then Beamery, and then we're going to get cracking with a couple of questions.
Yeah, absolutely. So my background, I am an engineer and product manager by trade. I've been at Beamery for about 4 years. I'll come on to a little bit about what Beamery does. But prior to Beamery, this is my first job in kind of HR tech. Prior to that, interestingly enough, I worked at Tesco for 4 years during a pandemic. And I was the product manager, owned all the till software, all of the online software. So when everyone was trying to buy toilet paper and they weren't able to, that was my decisions being made around how to restrict all of that kind of stuff. Very interesting background, very interesting time working in a scale of an organization. One of the reasons I took a change into HR tech, because I had a very large team and I was struggling to do strategic workforce planning. I had product people with certain skills working on certain products that was not a good fit for them. I think about product almost like life cycle. You have introductory growth and maturity, and different product managers work well on different types of products at different life cycle stages. And I spent about half a year building a very complex spreadsheet of understanding people's skills and the requirements of their jobs, and actually how do we fit them in the right places. When I started to look elsewhere, I came across Beamery and saw what we were doing. I was like, this is the problem I've been dealing with as a leader for the last half of a year, and I've not been able to solve. And so that really kind of made me go into this kind of HR tech kind of space. A little bit about Beamery. Our mission as an organization is to create equal access to work. We believe that using a skills-based approach to talent decisions is a fair and ethical way to do things. Essentially, our platform is essentially in 2 parts. We have a traditional CRM that helps organizations hire talent quickly. We have some of the largest Fortune 500 customers using our platform today to essentially reduce that time to hire and get talent in as quickly as possible. That is both employees and external talent. We use a proprietary skill-based AI to match candidates against jobs. And in the last 3 years, I've been spending time trying to help solve that first step of that strategic workforce planning goal, right? I think the last few years, the utopia of strategic workforce planning boils down to data foundations. Do you understand your people? Do you understand your jobs? For the last 4 years at Beamery, we've been focusing on that problem. How do we help organizations have a very good view of their talent, a very good view of their jobs, and how does that live across the systems they need to use, like your HCM, your development systems, etc. Our products kind of split into two. It complements each other, but really our recruitment and our kind of skills-based platform. And that's what our customers use us for today. So yeah, that's a little bit about Beamery and why I'm doing the thing I'm doing.
That's absolutely brilliant. Really good references on past experiences, the battle scars to bring into this role to look at improvements in products. Becki, I want to get your perspective on what Tom was talking about. One of the first questions I was going to ask, almost as a let's set the record straight. I think a lot of people listening to this podcast who will be very well aware about strategic workforce planning. They might even have it in their job title, or maybe they're an analytics person. So we don't want to teach them to suck eggs. Let's do a ground zero at base point, the interpretation of what strategic workforce planning means to you, Becki, and then Tom, if you want to build on that as well. Let's talk about some of the nuances around the role. How does it fit in the skills conversation? And then we're going to get into the bit around skills versus tasks as well, because that's important as well. But let's start off, Becki, just with that kind of strategic workforce planning to you.
I think it's really all about businesses and organizations having a clear strategy and a clear plan, a data-driven plan around how they are going to build a workforce and continue to develop a workforce that really helps to meet the kind of goals of the organization. Then, as Tom alluded to, working kind of in retail during COVID, it's been a very tough 5 years or so. And for organizations across all sectors, it's been a difficult time. Everything's changed with working from home, with them returning to the office, with skills, with AI coming in. There's so much change. It feels like it's been a big period of change for organizations, and they're having to adapt quickly to these changes. We're now competing for the same people coming into the workforce. New generations are coming out of universities or schools, stepping into roles that haven't previously existed. So it's this really complex landscape that all organizations are operating in. Strategic workforce planning for us at LACE, and I'm sure for everyone in this space, is all about building a logical, data-driven approach to manage that, rather than being really reactive and having to make decisions really quickly and probably not as effectively, as much as you can based on what you know about the culture and the time we're living in and the organization you want to be, helping to put some numbers and some values and some data to that, and really helping to build a plan that is iterative and changing, that's going to help you get to that end goal. So it's really all about using the information you have in a way that means you're continuing to learn from it and continuing to develop, making it smarter, using tools that are constantly learning to really help to build a structured approach to how you're going to support and grow your workforce going forward. So that's kind of a very long-winded way of saying it does what it says on the tin, it's in the name.
Tom, do you want to riff off that a little bit? And then let's get into that conversation about how skills are linked into it, because there's probably an element of cynical people thinking, how do I take the skills I have right now and predict what skills I need in the future? Tom, I'll let you riff off that.
Yeah. No, it's a really good point. And look, I work in product and I love solving problems. I think the really interesting problem here is, how do you bridge the gap between business strategy and talent strategy? I don't think anyone has managed to do that well in the industry yet. And there's a lot of conversation around it. And it's more of a, going back to kind of product terms, it's more of a vision of an organization we want to be, rather than something that organizations are doing on a regular basis. I also think part of it is how you deal with the uncertain future. Right. I think so many organizations think about, we need a plan for 5 years' time. We need to understand where we're going. Part of this work is actually just you don't know what's around the corner. If the last 3 years have taught us anything, we don't know what's around the corner. Macroeconomic, climate, wars, emerging technology, all of these things are going to disrupt your organization in some way. Organizations need to have an agile way of dealing with that problem. The answer is skills, tasks through the lens of workforce planning. My advice to some organizations I speak to is try not to be too purist about this, trying to be practical. You can solve a lot of the agility problems just by understanding your workforce rather than planning for the next 10 years. Not many organizations are doing that very well at this point in time.
Let's talk about that. Let's expand, because we were just talking before we went live around this idea of the tasks versus skills conversation. So you've got a very specific sort of perspective on that, Tom. Can you build that one out? And then Becki, in reverse to Tom, riffing off, if you want to riff off of him, that would be great. Tom, this idea of task versus skills would be good to explore.
It's a really interesting topic, and it's something that has been in the back of my mind for a few years now. I think we talk about a skills-based organization and the transition towards it. I would like to start thinking about how organizations can also be a task-based organization and moving towards it. Skills are really great for helping you have a very wide net of talent that you can attract and mobility options you have in terms of employees and external talent. What it's not good at is capturing the work that needs to happen, if that makes sense, right? And so I think about a job at the highest level of definition of the work that needs to be done and the skill at the anatomy, almost like the DNA of your organization. There's something in between that captures actually the context of what needs to happen, right? And that is usually the task. And so the way that we've started to be thinking about this at Beamery is actually, jobs break down into tasks and tasks break down into skills. We think about skills as the way to match talent against those tasks and jobs rather than the definition of the work that needs to be done. And I think this is true if I was to say to either of you today, tell me your 15 skills, it's an abstract question that gets quite hard quite quickly. If I say to you, tell me the 5 tasks you do on a day-to-day basis, you'd be able to reel that off pretty quickly. And within that, you're talking about skills, but you're talking about the context. Humans like context and descriptors of things, not units. And I think that's the difference. On top of that, if you think about workforce planning and going back to the point I made earlier around business strategy connected to talent strategy, when you think about business strategy, I need to get these things done, which are essentially tasks. I actually think this is going to be a big unlock to allow strategic workforce planning to happen more effectively. If organizations can say, here are the tasks that I need to have done over a period of time, and then having systems break them down into skills and giving you options of everyone that could potentially do that task, right? And I think that is the natural evolution of where we're going. It's interesting because we've come from a world where we had competency libraries, which are kind of tasks, and then we went to skills, and now we're kind of like, oh, cool, that's good, but there's something in between. We've lost a bit of context. We've kind of gone to an extreme, which I think is really valuable because from an AI perspective, skills is really important. But I think the industry is starting to come back in terms of there's something in the middle that we need to focus on, and that is what we see as being tasks.
Nice. Becki, do you want to build on that?
Yeah, no, I think it's a really great point, really interesting. And I think it's a conversation we're having a lot at Lace as well about these different words that exist within this space and the different definitions. I know we've got a great article on our website around this kind of equation of skills plus behaviors plus competencies. And I think Tom's right. It's ever evolving and ever changing, and it's kind of cyclical. When I think about skills, I'm thinking about them from a data point, from an analytics point of view. I'm thinking about a tag, a label that we can stick on as a person or a role and say, this is something that's needed for this job to happen. There's a fundamental element there, which is actually what's the piece of work that they're doing on a daily basis? What's the underlying task that's happening that we need to be able to stick a skill to? It links to conversations we've been having about equal access to work and being able to kind of, what is a fair application, fair recruitment process? How do we make sure we have the right people for the job? There's an element with skills that you can quantify and validate, but does that mean that the job gets done? It's all about trying to label and assign skills and tasks to then match those up so that you're really getting the right people to in the right roles that's going to help ultimately drive, your business strategy forward and get people doing tasks that help the business grow and meet your goals. So yes, it's really interesting. And I think we could probably talk for a long time about all the different words and definitions, and maybe other people have different thoughts and views on their own, but it's a fascinating area.
Yeah, I think it's very fascinating. And again, I think the thing that sticks out for me, what you were talking about there, is the context, Tom, because if you think about these organizations that work in the big, like the Googles, that work in these matrix structures where they have a project team that works on it, ultimately what they're working towards is a bunch of tasks. And then certain people have the skills that set into that. How do we then, as an entity, find out which skills we need in order to do these tasks? Technology is a key important driver towards that. So can I get your thought around the role that technology can play in helping to connect those dots? We've got a bunch of jobs to do, work that needs to get done. We've got a bunch of people that have a bunch of skills. How are we going to match these so that we get the best people working on this set of tasks? So the role of tech, and maybe, I guess we've got the AI question that might as well throw in there as well, how AI impacts that too.
Organizations are sitting on an incredible amount of data. about their people and about their jobs. I rarely come across an organization that's like, actually, we don't have job descriptions, we don't have information on people. They're usually drowning in it, and they usually don't know how to interpret it, right? I think the first role that technology can play in this space is to make sense of all of that data. We work with some organizations that when we go through this process of trying to make sense of their jobs and normalize it using AI, they will have close to 500 job descriptions for one single job in their organization, because every manager has taken the job and adjusted it slightly for a market, region, or whatever else. So you end up in this situation where you've got a lot of data you're kind of swimming in, you don't really know how to make sense of it. So I think the first thing that technology can do is actually to get you to a foundation that you can actually work with, right? And breaking down those jobs into skills, into tasks, and actually like deduplicating and normalizing all of that data. That's really important. The same thing is on the people side. There is a lot of information on people that you have, CV, experience, performance information, learning development. You've got all this data. That foundational piece can be really helped by technology. When it comes to essentially, how do you see fit? How do you see a individual fit to a role or a task or a skill? This is where the importance of skill adjacency and task adjacency come into effect, and where we see a huge amount of benefit for our customers utilizing it. For example, not everyone knows you can upskill from JavaScript to Python in a certain amount of time. If that was known when you're making a talent decision, and that time frame was, let's say, 2 months on average, you may make a talent decision that's slightly different just by saying that person doesn't have a skill of Python or a skill of X or a Y. That's the other part that technology can play here, actually saying, you know what, the jump from this skill to this skill isn't huge, and it usually takes people this amount of time to upskill. Is that an acceptable trade-off? We all do it today inadvertently. Whenever I've hired people, you never get an exact skill match. There's always a trade-off. You never know what that trade-off is. It's always okay, cool, yeah, meets 95%, but there's a gap there. But knowing how to close that gap and knowing what path is best trodden to close that gap is how technology can really help, right? And I think that's the benefit. So, we're in a really interesting place now where the technology, with the emergence of large language models and innovative AI, can solve these challenges at scale effectively, whereas traditionally they were spreadsheets, consultancies, large transformation projects that run for multiple years, etc.
Interesting. Becki, you're nodding there. Don't know if you want to build on that.
I would nodding furiously. Yeah, completely agree with everything Tom's saying. I think it's particularly, we have a workforce analytics team who work with clients specifically dealing with these issues. And I think it's something we hear time and time again: data quality, volume of data, lack of ownership of data, not one single source of truth. I think it can feel for many of our clients very overwhelming. And as Tom said, they don't necessarily realize they have this data, or they have so much of it that they're not sure how to begin to structure it and get those valuable insights. So I think absolutely we can build out that process, work with them to understand what that looks like and how to start to approach that to really get that value at scale. That's where technology has the ability to come in and help quickly and effectively to start to overcome some of those barriers and make sense of this volume of data, start to consolidate, simplify, and align across the business as well. As you said, if you've got 15 different job descriptions for a very similar role, it can really play a valuable part in starting to get through the noise of all the data. You're starting from a solid foundation, which is going to bring valuable pieces of work off the back of it, such as better talent, recruiting internally. It's an area that's so interesting and so up and coming. It's great.
Yeah. And the other thing about it is you need to make sure that there's so many different bits of value that you take if you're doing it correctly, if you have implemented and you have the right approach to the technology. You've given some examples around simplifying things like job functions or job types. You were talking about the talent bit and the skills adjacency, which I thought was quite interesting. Imagine if you're able to look at your own database and say, right, instead of just looking at these types of people, we've now opened up. We don't even have to spend lots more money on going out to the market, because it turns out we thought we had 150 people internally through our own data sets that could do this job. But actually, because of this skills adjacency, we now have 1,500 people across the internal databases. And so suddenly it becomes that ability to reduce cost. But I think also there's an element of being able to articulate that value is quite important as well, I think, Tom, right?
Yeah, it is. And look, this is a transformation right? It always is a transformation. This takes time. Even though technology is there to help accelerate that process, there is still a lot of organizational change required. You need your managers to understand how to deal with this data and how to interpret this data. You need your recruitment processes to change to utilize this data. You need your performance management, your mobility teams to leverage this data. And I think that is often the thing that overwhelms an organization. It's like, wow, we've got this data problem, this technology problem, we've got this organizational problem, and they all kind of intertwined together. And then that becomes almost paralysis on starting. And I think one thing that we find is like, be really precise on like a division or a problem that you want to solve, utilizing skills and tasks, and prove value from there. If you try and go big bang, it's going to take you multiple years to try and get anything in place and getting everyone on board. You've got various stakeholders to convince and bring on board with this. You have to be very specific to stick to a problem, a use case, a division, start small, grow big. I'm a product person, so like MVP, prove value, grow from there, right? Same thing has to be true when you go through a skills-based transformation.
We are almost out of time, but I've got one more question for both of you guys. We talked about, and I talked right at the beginning, how lots of people talk about their approach to SWP. It varies from organization to organization. It's quite a complex thing to get right. And as you said, Tom, not a lot of businesses are really nailing it, probably because of that complexity. So if we're doing this podcast in 5 years' time or 10 years' time, where would you like to see organizations at in terms of their journey towards being skills first or skills based organizations? And then I'm asking Becki to give her 2 penneth worth as well. But Tom, as our guest, your thoughts first on that 5 to 10 years time, strategic workforce planning. Where are we at?
So I think, as I said before, I would expect organizations to be task-based organizations as well as skill-based organizations. I think that's the first major unlock. And I really do see that going that way. The other thing, which is a little bit more dystopian, but there is going to be a mixture of a digital and a human workforce in the next 5 years, with agentic workflows coming in and more automation on specific things. There's going to be that mix. So I think the thing I would be expecting organizations to be able to do is actually break down their work into tasks, understand what tasks are going to be driven by automation, what tasks are going to be driven by humans, and optimize their workforce in that way. That is the way it has to go for it to be effective and scalable.
Love it. Becki?
Yeah, I think Tom's spot on there, really. I think it's about kind of rethink how we think about skills and tasks and jobs in general. I think that opinion and attitude will be in a very different place by then. And I think you're right. It's going to be a very different landscape. Again, even though last 5 years it's already changed, I think in 5-10 more years, it will be radically different as well. We've got new generations of people coming into the workforce as well, who've got different expectations around what a job looks like, what roles may look like. So I think it's going to be really interesting. I think for me as well, what we would hope to be seeing with organizations is more data literacy in this space. Big transformation projects that mean they've got a clearer accountability and awareness of their data, better data that they're being able to use in a more effective way, and better reporting and insights off the back of that. That's really helping to drive that. I'm really hopeful that we will see that reflected in some of the bigger pieces of reporting that happen. So I'm thinking the impact this can have from an equality and diversity point of view on things like gender pay gap or gender balance across roles. I think this has the potential, if organizations get this right, because to Tom's point earlier, that skills adjacency piece, it's not necessarily about looking for very specific skills that a person has. It's about being able to see the potential in people. And that has a real impact on people who would be typically less likely to apply for jobs because they don't feel like they meet the criteria. I think I'm hopeful we will see a real shift in perceptions of how work happens and how people then are able to fit into those roles, and how that kind of shapes the sort of a more equal and diverse workforce that we're working in as well. So fingers crossed that's where we're headed.
That's a really lovely way of thinking about things, but not unachievable. We started off this podcast talking about, and Tom mentioned, do you understand people and the jobs that they are doing? And how do you deal with that uncertain future? It sounds to me that organizations being able to grapple with this approach of task-based organizations, as well as understanding and being able to code up the skills, is very important. Tom, absolutely amazing to have you on. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having us. And also, you like just really great conversation. I loved hearing about the unexploded bomb hiding in your back garden.
Yeah. If you don't hear from me ever again, then my horrible nightmare has actually come true. I've Nostradamus myself in a bit of a pickle if I'm never on this podcast again. Becki, thank you very much for joining us as always and helping me with co-hosting today.
Thank you for having me on again.
It's been great to have you on. If you have enjoyed this podcast, please tell us. Or if you've got any suggestions for topics you'd like us to cover, then please just reach out to us. If you'd like to speak to the guys at Beamery, it's Tom Shurrock. They can just check you out on LinkedIn, can't they, Tom?
Yep. Yeah, please reach out.
Hopefully you've enjoyed this podcast. You can get it wherever you get your podcast. But for now, from myself, from Becki, and from Tom, thank you very much for listening. And we'll catch you next time on the HR on the Offensive podcast. Bye-bye.